experience is what happens in the brain? Is there any good reason to say that experience is what happens in the brain? Which, of course, is the mantra in universities and in research groups and all the rest. But a mantra is a mantra. The question is whether there's any reason for it. And I'm inclined to say no. In fact, I'm inclined to say that there are very serious obstacles to the idea, and they are not based on the current state of ignorance about the brain. That's not the issue. So I'm in the middle of an argument of principle on this matter. I'll just bring you up to where we are. The two other guys who were here yesterday, and I think they're coming. If you ask somebody why they think experience is what goes on in the brain, they will tell you we have very elaborate correlations between experience and brain events. And even though I'm inclined to be skeptical about that, but that's what they say. And if that's what they say, I'm going to take them at their word and see where they go from there. So when you have a pain in your tooth, this part of the brain lights up, and when you're thinking about language, that part of the brain lights up, and when you are solving a mathematical problem, that part of the brain lights up. So they claim that they have a correlation between what's going on in your conscious experience on the one hand and what's going on in the brain on the other hand. That's what they claim. Okay. Now, we're shooting for a conclusion that experience is what goes on in the brain. So what we're being served so far is we have a very elaborate correlation between A and B, therefore A is B. That's not very convincing. Just because A and B are correlated with one another, therefore they're identical? Does that usually follow? No. I mean, lightning and thunder are correlated with one another, but lightning is lightning and thunder is thunder. Being a species that gives birth to live young and a species that has bodily hair is correlated, but having bodily hair is one thing and giving birth to live young is something else. Both mammals, let's account the platypus, which is controversial. Yeah.
What do they do all these studies on people who have brain damage, and they study how they're different and what's happening, and is that better than correlation, or is that?
Sounds to me like correlation. You ask, we're talking about experience now. We're not talking about the fact that they're unable to do various things. We're not talking about abilities now. We're talking about experience. That's the issue we're addressing.
So there's this one study. There's this guy he had a normal guy, and he suddenly started having these pedophilic desires and whatever, and this normal guy, and then they found that he had a brain tumor in his brain, and they took it out, and he went back to normal to being a regular guy.
Isn't that a correlation? It's a correlation between desires and the state of the brain.
So, okay.
It's correlation.
How is that not direct causation?
How is it?
It might be causation. Causation is also correlation. Think, if A causes B, A and B are not the same thing. They can't be the same thing. If A is really causing B, then they're different things.
Right.
So we're now investigating a proposition that experience is what goes on in the brain. If you tell me your experience is caused by what goes on in the brain, the natural picture is, okay, the brain is one thing, experience is something else, and this causes that.
Experience in what sense? Like
A toothache, thinking about Gibraltar, trying to solve a mathematical problem, joy, experience.
So it goes on in the brain as opposed to where?
Oh, as opposed to anywhere else. In other words, the proposition is experience is events in the brain.
If you didn't have the neural pathways, right, then you wouldn't experience it.
That's true, but that doesn't yet say that they're identical. That only says that they're correlated.
So the difference.
One second.
So if it can't get to the brain, you can't experience it.
That may very well be true, but that doesn't cinch the proposition that experience is what goes on in the brain. All that you could conclude from that is that experience is correlated with what goes on in the brain.
Right. And that's it's just guessing on based on what we currently know. That's what we have been able to determine, I guess.
Okay, we've been able to determine that they're correlated.
Yeah.
And the proposition I'm considering is a stronger proposition that they're identical. Now, I'm asking the people who believe they're identical, and there are lots and lots of them, I'm asking them, why do you believe what you believe? You tell me that experience is brain events. I want to know your reason for saying that. The reason they always give me is there's a correlation. Okay, there's a correlation, but correlation does not imply identity. What more can you tell me to convince me that it's not just two separate things that are correlated with one another, but it's really the same thing? What more can you tell me? If they don't tell me anything else, they have not given me enough reason to be convinced. Now, there is a pathway for them to go down. There are times when science discovers identities, not just correlations, but identities. And these are accepted. For example, that sound is certain patterns of airwaves, or that heat is random molecular motion, or that water is H2O. In those cases, science is discovering what things are, not just a correlation. Water is H2O. Sound is airwaves. So then the thought is, okay, the person I'm attacking says, you want me to back up my conviction that experience is what goes on in the brain? I'll do it in the same way that science has successfully discovered and demonstrated that sound is airwaves, and that heat is random molecular motion, and that water is H2O. I'll do that for experience in the brain. I'll show you that experience is related to the brain, something like the way sound is related to airwaves, or heat is related to molecular motion, or water is related to H2O. If they could do that, if they could copy the pattern of successful identifications and show that it applies here, that would be a reason to let them upgrade their evidence of correlation into a claim of identity. So the investigation now is to see whether they can do that.
Yeah, I feel like it's very, very difficult to prove.
And this, step by step. You are convinced that sound is airwaves?
Based on the knowledge that I have been taught, it has been shown to be proven that sound is airwaves, yes.
Okay. So you're not skeptical about doing this in general?
No, I'm just saying that it'll be difficult. And a proof for it will be quite a discovery.
Well, let's see. Let's see if they can fulfill this project of copying the pattern that we have for sound and airwaves, heat and molecular motion, water and H2O. If they can copy that pattern for experience and what goes on in the brain, they'll be home free. Let's see if they can do it.
Right.
So now there are three possibilities. Either they do it, or they don't do it, but for some reason which isn't fundamental, we just don't know enough about how the brain works or something like that, or there's some fundamental block in fulfilling that task. I'm going to argue there's a fundamental block.
What do you mean a fundamental block?
I mean a block that's not going to be overcome by further research.
That we will not understand how the brain works.
No. No matter how much you understand about the brain works, it won't do this job. The problem is not understanding how the brain works.
So
it won't do this job.
their argument is an invalid one.
It's not going to work. They have a project. It's not going to work. They're going to fail at the project.
They're going to have a missing link.
And that's right. And then, since they fail at that project, we'll be thrown back to the beginning stage.
No, but you're not saying that we won't discover how the brain works.
No.
It'll just be working in a different way than what they're hypothesizing currently.
No. The thought I'm going to, and this is all abstract, I haven't given you any of the argumentation, but the thought I'm going to is you can understand fully how the brain works correctly, and you still will not be able to do the job of showing that experience is related to the brain the way sound is related to airwaves or the way water is related to H2O. It won't be the same relationship.
So you can have experience without the brain? Is that what you're saying?
No, they might be correlated. Remember where we started from. We started from the idea that even if they're correlated, that doesn't show they're identical. They might be fully correlated. If they're fully correlated, you can't have one without the other. And still, they're not identical. You can't have lightning without thunder. You can't have thunder without lightning. But they're not identical. Lightning is not thunder, and thunder is not lightning.
I get what you're saying.
Okay, but this is very abstract. I'm going through step by step. So now, the first thing I want to do is outline for you how the identifications, or what they're called in the literature, reductions, how they work for sound on the one hand and water on the other hand. And then we'll start to look at whether experience in the brain can be put into that format. If they can be put into that format, then the person I'm interviewing wins. And I'm prepared to allow him the victory. So let's see. Sound works like this. Before people knew what sound is, before they knew that it's patterns of airwaves, what did we know about sound? All we knew about sound is what it does. We had what's called a functional definition or description of sound. We knew lots of things that cause sound, like beating on drums and fires and scraping the blackboard with your fingernails and screaming and so forth and so on. We knew a lot about the effects that sound has. One effect that sound has is your auditory experiences. Another is making things vibrate. Sound behaves a lot like a physical thing on general grounds. When a sound is produced, the farther away you are from it, the softer it gets. It seems like dissipates over space. You have a very tightly enclosed room and you bang a drum inside. Nobody hears it outside because the sound is trapped inside. Sound bounces off barriers. You get echoes. It does seem like sound is a physical object. It behaves the way a physical object behaves. It's just that no one had a clue which physical object it is. Just imagine, he's banging a drum over there, and he's over there listening to it, and I know the sound is getting from the drum to him, so it's got to be going right past me, right? Right past me. So where is it? I don't touch it, I don't feel it, I don't smell it, it doesn't wave the paper in my hand. Like, where is it? Only in very low pitch. Otherwise, your body doesn't feel me speaking. You can hear it, but you don't feel it. Right? So the mystery was, which physical object is it? And then, in the 19th century, the thought was it's patterns of air particles moving in certain systematic ways. Now, how did the identification come about? All I know about sound is it does these things. Somebody says, hey, take a look at Q. Watch, and I'll show you that Q does every one of those things. It fills those slots. Well, if Q fills those slots, that's good enough reason to say that Q is sound, because all I knew about sound was what it does. That's all the information I had about it, is what it does. So now I find something that does all those things, that's a good enough reason to say that is the sound. That's called, starting with a functional definition. It's a definition of the thing on the basis of how it functions. Then you find something that fulfills the functions. That's enough to say I've discovered what the thing is. Another good example of this is genes. Gregor Mendel did experiments in the 1830s with pea plants and other things, and he saw patterns of carrying over features from generation to generation. So he said, something's got to carry over that information. Let's call it genes. What is it? Each little plant has its own little leprechaun that tells the next one what it is? No one had a clue. Nobody had a microscopic picture of the DNA. It was the 50s until the DNA, 1950s, till DNA was discovered to be the bearer of the genes. Then we now say we know, although there are problems, but we now say we know that it's the DNA that carries that information from generation to generation. And you could say we've discovered what the gene is. Because when you started, the gene was only a function. It was whatever carries the information. Okay, and this carries the information, so that's the gene. That's the pattern with sound. Pattern with water is a little different. Because in the case of water, we have an embarrassment of riches. We have functions. We know what water does. We know how it behaves. We know how it behaves at different temperatures. We know that it nourishes plants and nourishes animals and can drown both, actually. And it has a certain specific heat and viscosity and all the rest. We know a lot about its behavior, and we also have samples. We have actual samples of water. So if somebody wants to argue that water is H2O, he has a double job. First of all, he has to show that H2O will do all the things that water does. That's just like sound. That's taking the functions of water and showing that H2O performs those functions. And although you mentioned before about what you're taught, and that's not a bad reference. Although I've read recently that there are some difficulties around the fringes with water. Some of the things it does aren't really explained yet with H2O. But let's leave that aside. Let's assume that H2O does chemically all the things that water does. But in addition, I have glasses of water. I need to have some good reason to think that stuff in the glass is H2O, in addition to the functions. Those are two separate jobs. And in fact, the way it's done in science is you pass an electric current through the stuff in your glass, and it's replaced little by little by hydrogen and oxygen. The liquid disappears, and what you end up with if you have a closed container, the liquid disappears, and what you end up with is hydrogen and oxygen in the right proportions. You say, oh, see? What the electricity is doing is pulling the water apart into its pieces, and there's the hydrogen and oxygen right in front of you. So if you have both the description of the functions carried out by H2O on the one hand, and you have the decomposition of what's in the glass into hydrogen and oxygen, then you have met both criteria, and you have good reason to think that water is H2O. And I think both are necessary because if you had one without the other, you would not be satisfied. For example, if you calculate chemically that H2O will do everything that water will do, but when you pass the electric current through the stuff in the glass, you get sulfur and neon and and carbon and so forth and so on. I think what you'd say is, well, okay, H2O does all those functions, but there must be some other chemical compound that does those functions also. Who says H2O is the only chemical compound that does it? Maybe another one does it also and has sulfur and neon and copper in it. I think we'd be skeptical. And the other way around, if you passed an electric current through the water and you ended up with hydrogen and oxygen, but you calculate hydrogen and oxygen, H2O will not nourish plants, and it will not drown people, and then you'd say, well, come on, we know water does that stuff. So it can't be that water is H2O. And what happened in the glass when you put the electric current through and got hydrogen and oxygen, maybe the electric current changed it. Maybe it's not made of hydrogen and oxygen. When you attack water with electricity, that changes the molecules and you get other stuff out and not the stuff that was really in there in the first place. We're not going to be satisfied unless you get both. You want to see that the H2O does what water does, and you want to have good reason to think the stuff in the glass is in fact H2O. When you have both of those, then you can declare that you have discovered that water is H2O. Okay, so we have two patterns. We have the sound pattern, which has one feature. We have the water pattern, which has the sound feature, plus another feature of having samples and trying to see that the sample's really made of H2O as well. We together so far? Mm-hmm. Okay, now, the first crucial move is to ask, what is the experience to brain relationship like? Are we going to pattern it after sound and airwaves or pattern it after water and H2O? The difference between them is, do we have samples or not?
Yeah.
It's, to even ask the question is embarrassing. I mean, you're having them right now, right? Aren't you having conscious experience right now? How could anybody, although there are some, like Daniel Dennett, how could anybody even question whether there are samples of conscious experience? I mean, as many put it, your conscious experience is something you're more sure of than anything else. Right? Anything else you could be more or less mistaken about, but that you're having conscious experience is something that it's impossible to even call into question. What should you do? Doubt it? Doubting is also an experience, playing on Descartes. Right? So you can't coherently doubt that you're having an experience, because the doubting itself is an experience. So it's just bizarre, which means we're going to have to work with the water pattern. Not with the sound pattern, with the water pattern. For experience of the brain, we're going to do a double job. First of all, show that the brain does the functions that experience has, that experience does, and also show that conscious experiences somehow can be seen to be or argued to be what goes on in the brain, firings of neurons somehow. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say, so we would ask, because I thought about our conversation yesterday. We would have to ask a critic to define what they see as consciousness, not just a correlation of experience in brain, but what is, like water and H2O. Water is H2O. And you can break water apart and see that. Neurons and firing, that's electrical impulses. So are we going to ask the critic, so do you think consciousness is the electrical impulses in the brain interpreting the experiences? And
No, don't put it. Don't put that. That's now you're going around in a circle. Yes, he's going to say that consciousness is firings in the brain.
the firings in the brain, which is electrical impulses.
That's right.
So electricity
Yeah, okay,
has
okay.
more properties than water.
What's this?
Electricity.
Experience has more properties than water also.
Exactly. So
that's a good match.
it is a good match. So, and electricity can travel through objects. It can travel through air.
Yeah.
It can travel within a confined area. So we have to take all these properties and say, if you're going to say consciousness is the electrical impulses, then you have to say that consciousness will also share the same properties.
No, it's the same properties as the electrical impulses in the brain. They can't travel outside the brain. They
Yes,
can't.
They can use machines that they put on the outside of the brain that reads those electrical impulses, because electrical
Okay.
impulses travel outside the skull.
Okay. You're okay. I'll take what you said, and I'll just
Please, by all means.
there are elements of the electrical impulses which don't express themselves in consciousness. When I say A is B, it doesn't follow that A is all of B,
I didn't say all.
but you are using that. You are using that. You're using that. When I say that consciousness is electrical impulses in the brain, it doesn't mean that every feature electrical impulses have consciousness has. Doesn't follow. That doesn't follow. That means electrical consciousness is only what the electrical impulses do. They might do other things as well, but that may not be that may not show in what consciousness does.
So I've had personal experiences with using the net that they use to read your brain waves while doing cognitive operations. Therefore, that is a conscious decision that they are reading from my brain. They're reading those electrical waves
That's right.
from a conscious decision.
That's right. That's what they'll say.
So they're picking up my conscious reactions
That's what they say.
through the electricity
That's what they say.
that my brain is going through.
That's what they say.
So therefore, that electricity is already, not saying that everything in the brain is
Yeah.
that conscious decision,
Yeah, right.
because functional MRIs will have multiple areas
That's
going
right.
on for a
That's
single event. But already we could see that they are able to read outside the tissue of the brain, through the bone, through the skin, that my electrical impulses of consciousness are traveling outside of my head.
No, that doesn't follow.
They're detecting them
Look,
inside the skull.
look. I can see you from here. That doesn't mean you're over here. What I'm seeing is you over there. You're only over there.
The thing
But I'm
is
over here
they're
and seeing
able
you
to
over
see
there.
them through
This
that.
thing can detect what's going on in the brain. Doesn't mean that that it's going on outside the brain.
It's on the outside that's picking it up.
I'm standing over here and it's picking you up. Not where you are. I'm detecting you from afar.
You could also detect me with outside.
I could, but right now I'm detecting you from afar. It is possible to detect you from afar. So that's what these things are doing. They're detecting what's going on in the brain from a distance away. That doesn't mean it's going on outside the brain. There's just symptoms coming out. Anyway, so I'm asking them now. Oh, so if we agree that we have samples of experience, then they have to do the double job. Let's take them through the functional job, which is fairly easy, and I think that's reasonably convincing. And then we'll start working on the sample job. So let's see. Somebody steps on my foot, and I have a pain. Experience has taught me, step on my foot, I'm going to have a pain. That's a physical event causing an experience. Also, when I have a pain, I usually react. Sometimes I go get an aspirin, and depending upon the cause, I might react in other ways. Somebody steps on my foot, there are various things I might do. Effects of experience of pain on my behavior is the motions of my body, is pretty standard. We know how that works, right? Now somebody says, well, look, the foot to the experience, that's carried by the brain. Because after all, when you step on the foot, there's a neural message that goes all the way up to the brain, doesn't it? And when you go to get the aspirin or react in other ways to the guy who stepped on your foot, that behavior is triggered by impulses from the brain being carried out by the muscles. So in between the stepping on the foot and the getting the aspirin stands the brain. And the brain events seem to play that role of carrying you from stepping on the foot to the behavior That's what's standing in between doing that function. I think you could do that widely with a good correlation. And therefore, someone who says, if you look at the function of experience, if you look at what it does, how it behaves, brain events are a good candidate for what carries that function. I think that's reasonable, and I'm not going to fight with that. What bothers me, and it's not me, it's these eminent philosophers, is the idea that my conscious experience is neurons firing in the brain. Here we need some way to see that that's so, like in the case of water, where you pass electricity through it and it becomes hydrogen oxygen, just becomes hydrogen oxygen. Maybe we could take a conscious experience and sort of analyze it, break it up into pieces, tease it apart into certain little fragments and dimensions and say, oh yeah, that little fragment, that's a neuron firing. I see. If I take it down to the basic elements, then you could sort of see neurons around the corner petering out from the mist and say, yeah, those are neurons. Or the other way. You could start with the neurons and build them up, more complicated interactions, the more complicated firings, and maybe the first derivative of the firings or the second derivative of the firings, you can have acceleration and super acceleration and so forth and so on. And then as you build it up and get more and more of them and they're integrated, you see toothache pain in the brain. Build the experience in the brain or tease out the brain from the experience to make a bridge between them. That would be the first sort of attempt to do this. And people have thought about this. And I want to show you that both of these attempts are fruitless. And then there are arguments of principle why this is not going to work. You had a question?
So I have a few questions. So what about phantom pains? Then there is no limb at all, and you're still feeling pain in like your fingertips when you don't even have a hand.
Yeah, but I'm not sure what that has to do.
Then it's not traveling. There's no traveling sensation from the fingers themselves.
Yes, but again, this is directed towards the following proposition. Think of what pain does. Think of what pain does, how it behaves. Can we reasonably put brain events in that slot? Can we say that brain events do all the things that we know that experience does? So many experiences are caused by physical stimuli. Can I say that experience, if it's the physical stimulus that causes the physical event that causes the experience, can I put the brain in there in that slot? Well, the physical event causes neural impulses. The neural impulses go to the brain. Something does happen in the brain. So if you want a picture of how stepping on my foot gives rise to a pain, the brain is a natural thing to put in that slot. Now, if you have something which doesn't arise that way, okay, so then it doesn't have that behavior. What other behavior does it have? Well, when I have phantom limb pains, I go to doctors and I talk to them about it, and they give me certain techniques, and the techniques sometimes relieve the phantom pains and so on. So that phantom pain gives rise to behavior. Okay. And now, behavior is all contractions, relaxations of muscles, and that comes from the brain. So if you talk about the fact that phantom pain causes behavior, what can I stick in the role there for phantom pain to explain how it causes behavior? The brain is, again, a good candidate.
Right, okay.
Right, so only talking about what it does now. We're trying to analyze what are the things that experience does, and can we plausibly put the brain in for the function that the experience has? Functioning. That's entirely separate from the question of whether I can plausibly say that the brain is behind the samples of experience. Those are two separate questions. And I think once you talk about functioning, whatever the functioning happens to be, then it's very plausible. If you would have an experience that has no functioning at all, it wouldn't come into this question at all. We're just trying to mirror the functioning of experience. If you had an experience that was completely disconnected from any function, nothing caused it, didn't give rise to behavior or anything else, this question wouldn't arise for that one. Right? Then only the second question would arise. We're separating the two questions. Okay? So now what about finding the actual sample in the brain? So let's start with experience and see if we can find the brain behind the experience. Sitting here, and you're having a very complex experience. Part of it's visual, part of it's auditory, part of it's tactile. Each of these is in many dimensions themselves. Let's try to narrow it down and make it as simple as possible. and see if, as we narrow it down and get it simpler and simpler, we can sort of see that, yeah, there are neurons right there. Let's start, first of all, cut out the auditory and tactile. We'll just deal with the visual. Now, the visual experience you're having is very complex. A whole bunch of different things with all different colors and hues and shapes and so forth and so on. Focus only on color. But color comes in 3 dimensions. There's hue, saturation, and something else, brightness. So let's function on hue. Let's function on a single hue. No, it's what you're seeing, something you're actually seeing. There's something, I don't know, maybe like the blue in this cover or something.
Green behind you.
Oh, the green behind. Right, that's good. That's pretty uniform, right? Oh, that's what you meant. This green. You didn't mean green. I misunderstood your gesture. Okay, so that green. Okay. So now we've cut out the auditory and the tactile, and we've cut out the multiplicity of them, and we're talking only about this hue. Are we closer to neurons? Do we sort of see neurons in the hue? It's an experience. It's just as much an experience as the complex one. It's just a piece of a complex experience, and it's no less experience than the complex one. So like saying, I've got a pile of money, take 1 coin. Okay, 1 coin, is it less money? Is it not money, not really money, because only 1 coin? No, it's 1 coin of money. It's just as much money as the pile of coins was money. Just happens to be one piece of them. It doesn't become more neuron-like because I get simpler and simpler pieces. There are no neurons, on the horizon. There are no neurons peeking their heads out through the mist. It's just an experience of a hue, of color. Yeah.
But the way we experience that is through the firings of the rods and cones.
That's correlation. Now you're back to correlation. Our whole game here is to get beyond correlation. You're talking about the cause. As long as you're talking about A causes B, there's no reason to think that A and B are the same. I'm asking the fellow
So
who...
you're saying that the color green is neurons.
The experience of the color green is the firing of the neurons. That's his proposition.
You can't experience without neurons.
That just means it's a cause. That just means it's a cause. Doesn't mean that they're identical. You cannot ignite something without heating it up. But heating it up is one thing, and igniting is something else. Because there's a certain trigger energy for oxidation. You have to go above that trigger energy.
So the correlation of experience and neurons in the brain does not mean that consciousness is just the experience of neurons in the brain.
That's it. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. So we're trying to go beyond that. And one of the things we need to do is sort of see that the conscious experience is made out of neurons.
So we're saying then that experience exists without our being there. That's what you're saying, as opposed to experience only exists.
Who's we? That's not there.
I mean, if somebody with neurons isn't there, then there is an experience.
Then maybe so, because it's caused by neurons. Without the cause, you're not going to have the effect. That's true. But that doesn't mean the cause and the effect are identical. They're correlated, strongly correlated. That doesn't mean they're identical. Okay, let me work this the 2 ways, and then we'll put that on the table for a moment. So, starting with the experience and pulling it apart into its simplest pieces, its smallest pieces, its one-dimensional pieces, does not make any obvious progress towards its being neurons, more than it's being sand, or it's being stars, or it's being music, or something else. There's just no neurons in the picture. It's just more and more simple pieces of experience, but each piece is a full experience. It's fully experiential. It's nothing else. Yeah.
You could say the same thing about water before we knew how to separate the hydrogen and the oxygen.
Yes, you could do that.
So we may not just know how to separate.
That we may not, but I'm asking him for his reasons for concluding he's right. I'm not trying to prove he's wrong. I want to know what his reasons are for concluding that he's right.
Okay.
And I want to show that he has no adequate reason for saying that. I'm not proving he's wrong. This argument doesn't prove he's wrong. This argument just shows he needs to do something and he hasn't done it.
Okay.
Let's try it the other way. So say, find experiences in the brain. Okay, so experiences are complex. And your brain has in it approximately 80, 90, 100 billion neurons. So it's pretty complicated. So don't think of finding a spare neuron firing here and there. Of course not. You got to build it up. Build it up. It's got to be millions and millions, hundreds of millions of neurons, maybe scattered in different places, all firing at the same time. So you can't imagine doing this now. John Locke actually had an argument like this against the idea that the experience is in the brain 350 years ago. So you say, okay, some more neurons, and just make them more and more neurons, more electricity, more firings. Does it look like getting closer and closer to an experience? Let me give you a gross analogy. I say that living things can be made out of sand, just grains of sand. So what are you talking about? Have you tried 14 quadrillion grains of sand? You haven't tried that, have you? Not even Jones Beach has that many grains of sand. Well, you don't know then. Try a lot of grains of sand. I think we'll say, going the wrong direction, Life has lots and lots of complicated interacting parts, and there have to be different kinds of parts, and there has to be homeostasis, and just grains of sand isn't going to do that. It's not the right kind of thing to do that. Maybe we're wrong, but certainly I can't claim, since I haven't tried so many, so it's an open option, it doesn't look like the right stuff. This is just like electrical wires firing. Someone says that it's neurons. It means if you put together a few 100 million pieces of copper carrying electricity, there should be toothaches in there. It's just not at all obvious that we need to put more and more together. We have to do more and more brain research to find the toothaches. It sounds like you're looking in the wrong place. Again, this is not a proof, but it's just showing you that looking at it from the outside and trying to get over that gap, there's no reason whatsoever to think that you're going to get over that gap. Yeah.
Would it support our argument, not his argument, to say that consciousness goes beyond cognitive thought, such as the subconscious?
No, because feeling a toothache is also beyond cognitive thought. We're not limiting ourselves to cognitive thought at all. Experience.
You don't think that you're
Wait,
feeling.
let me take out cognitive thought then. Would subconsciousness help or hinder our argument?
Well, if it's subconscious, then it's not conscious. I'm talking about conscious experience. My subject is,
We're
can
talking
you
about
reduce?
consciousness?
Right.
The entirety of consciousness. Is not subconscious a part of consciousness?
Not usually. Subconscious means it's not conscious. Usually, that's what it means. That was such a mysterious thing. When Freud originally suggested it, they thought it was nonsense. And that's why it's such a gigantic discovery, because it's things that help to affect your behavior and you're not conscious of them. That's what subconscious means. It means below the level of consciousness.
Oh, active consciousness.
Below the level of consciousness, not consciously experienced. You can look it up. That's the usual definition of subconscious. At any rate, that's just intuitively thinking of pulling the experience apart and finding the neurons, like passing electricity through the water. Intuitively, it doesn't seem promising. Again, as you said, maybe someday we'll figure out a way to do it, but in the meantime, he has no reason to think it can be done. Building up experience out of more and more firings of neurons, it looks like they're different categories. So there's no promising argument on his side from this type of intuition or this type of imaginative investigation. That it just means that he can't do it by saying, look, obviously, if you take it apart enough, this is what you're going to get. Now, there are arguments in principle against the idea that our samples of consciousness are brain events. I'll give you one, and then I'll leave you for today, and you can think about it. What's today? Today's only Monday. This was created by a fellow named Frank Jackson, and although a number of years later he abandoned it in favor of a different point of view, there are many people who prefer Frank Jackson 1 to Frank Jackson 2. And the original argument is very widely used in the literature. Imagine Mary. Mary is a very gifted neuroscientist. And she was born into and raised in a black, white, and gray environment. No hues of color, just black, white, and gray. And she grew up and she studied neuroscience via computer. And she mastered everything in the brain that has to do with vision. She knows everything that goes on in the brain vis-a-vis vision. You tell her that retina was irradiated with light of a certain frequency, And she'll tell you, okay, it's this frequency, then these parts of the rods and cones will fire, and they'll trigger that part of the optic nerve, and that will trigger the higher centers of vision and visual consciousness, and all the rest. It'll go back and forth, and feedback circuits. And she knows the whole thing. She knows everything that goes on in the brain in terms of color experience, visual experience. Okay? Now, they take her out of her black, white, and gray environment, and she sees a fire hydrant or the top light at a traffic signal or a rose. She sees something red. Does she learn something new that she didn't know before?
No.
Well, most people are inclined to say yes, she learns what red looks like. She didn't know before what red looks like. Now she knows. With a light meter, she could say, oh, it's that frequency. I know, and I knew beforehand everything that goes on in the brain when the retina is irradiated with that frequency of light. But I didn't know what it looks like. And if she learned something new, then what it looks like isn't just a brain event, because beforehand she already knew all the brain events. So what it looks like can't be a brain event. That's a very simple, direct argument. I'll repeat it once more, and then we're going to quit for today. We'll start again with this tomorrow. She's raised in a black, white, and gray environment. She never sees any colors. She learns the brain, by the way. I remember a book by Richard Gregory where he taught the eye and brain, where many want to say that the brain for vision begins in the retina. Because that's where interpreting begins. That's where information processing begins. She knows everything from the retina all the way up through the brain. She knows everything that happens in all of your visual experience. In particular, take any particular wavelength of light, which determines its hue. She knows exactly what happens when that wavelength of light hits the retina and everything else that goes on. Now she goes out into a full color environment. Then she sees something red. Now the question is, when she sees something red, does she learn something new? And the intuition which many people share is, of course, she now knows what red looks like. And she didn't know that before. Well, if she knew everything that goes on in the brain before, and she now learned something new called what red looks like, then what red looks like can't be just an event in the brain. Because she knew everything in the brain beforehand she went out. And now she learned something new. That's one direct, simple argument that it can't be. Okay, we'll consider more arguments like that tomorrow.